Yeah, so basically the particular network that I'm writing about as it relates, in the Diddy scandal to, the entertainment industry, or the segment that really tried to dominate hip hop, is very similar to that which I argue was connected to Epstein. So there's this group that was formed in 1991 by Leslie Wexner, who of course is Jeffrey Epstein's main patron from 1985 until 2008, just intimately connected. You can't really tell where one ended and one began, especially after Epstein got power of attorney over pretty much all of Wexner's affairs in the very early 1990s. But anyway, this group was created by him and Charles Bronfman in 1991. It wasn't reported on until like 7 or 8 years later by the Wall Street Journal. The Wall Street Journal referred to it as the study group or the mega group. And basically what you have is this group of billionaires who pretty much all have ties to the Likud party in Israel, and also in their own family histories. Most of the known members that are named in that Wall Street Journal article have some sort of tie to organized crime. So that, of course, includes the Bronfmans. That would include Wexner. And if the only member that I didn't write about having organized crime ties, because I didn't know it at the time in my book, was Lawrence Tisch. But I found things since then, which are included in this article. So it's very interesting that you would have all of these figures sort of come together. They all seem to share organized crime ties. Some of them have intelligence affiliations. In the case of Tisch, he had served in intelligence at one point. In the case of the entertainment industry, Tisch owned CBS, which, controls Columbia Records and CBS Records and lots of other subsidiaries. The Bronfmans took over MCA. They took over Warner Brothers. They took over Def Jam. They took over Polygram, Interscope Records, just an insane amount of entities in the entertainment and music industry specifically, and had a lot of ties to this, particular nexus that we were talking about earlier. And so obviously in the Epstein case, I wrote a whole book about how, well, not exclusively about them, but how these figures seem to have a lot of connections to Epstein world as well, not just Wexner either. In the case of the Bronfmans, allegedly, it was a Bronfman insider trading scandal that led to Epstein being fired from Bear Stearns in the early 1980s, at which point he apparently begins interacting with intelligence, arguably because the counsel of Bear Stearns, just, a few months before Epstein was fired, was Bill Casey, who had just become CIA director around that time for Reagan. And then this is when Epstein begins hiding and finding money for powerful people and, allegedly criminals, people like Adnan Khashoggi, who were intelligence connected arms dealers. And all of these figures in the 1980s, allegations of him arms trafficking with figures like Douglas Leese being involved in some of the Iran-Contra era arms trafficking, becoming involved with Israeli intelligence, being connected with Robert Maxwell. All of that is alleged to have happened with Epstein in the 1980s or so, also overlapping with when he sort of enters Leslie Wexner's inner circle, which is also interesting in and of itself because Leslie Wexner was, according to Columbus police, well, in this document they heavily tried to suppress, but it's there. They suspected Wexner of involvement in the alleged mob-style murder of his tax attorney just days before his tax attorney was going to testify to the IRS. And also in that document, it basically details Wexner's ties to Genovese crime family interests. And so a lot of the crime family interests that pop up in the Epstein scandal, and also here in this at least first installment of, this investigation into Diddy, tend to be the Genovese crime family and the Gambino crime family. And actually, Sean Combs's father was apparently, a heroin trafficker tied to Gambino crime interests, allegedly also a federal informant. Diddy's been accused of being a federal informant. It's very possible Epstein was one as well, and somehow evaded charges for numerous things and got sweetheart deals because of his, alleged informing. Well, I think it's now admitted, deal as an informer. And there's a couple things throughout Combs's life, and beginning with the stampede. He was allegedly responsible in 1991, charges for having guns at nightclubs, assault charges, things like that he supposedly wiggled out of and shouldn't have been able to. That could have been explained by some sort of, relationship like that. And generally, as I, look through my book, a lot of these historical examples of people that threw parties and filmed everything for the purpose of sex blackmail, something that, that Diddy's also accused of, there tends to be some sort of information sharing relationship with, law enforcement or intelligence agencies. It just tends to happen. Kind of a long and storied history in the music industry through like Roulette Records and figures like Morris Levy, who, for example, funded the first hip hop label, Sugar Hill. And so, there's basically been this unorganized crime effort to dominate those particular labels for some time. And Davis stands accused of people that were once close to, Combs and later became rivals. Like Suge Knight and also his former bodyguard Gene Deal, of sort of training Diddy in this using drugs and sex to control people. Right. And also allegedly Russell Simmons of Def Jam engaged in that same type of behavior and sort of mentored Diddy in that, because Russell Simmons was obviously important, not just for Diddy, but also for Andre Harrell at Uptown Records. And that's how, Diddy, Sean Combs, first entered the music industry. And Russell Simmons is interesting for a few reasons. One of the reasons I point out that it hasn't really gotten a lot of coverage is his very early connection in the 1990s. Obviously, Def Jam was successful by then. He became very involved with this guy who later became a famous Hollywood director named Brett Ratner, who, along with Simmons, has been accused of committing sex crimes. And so now Simmons is like in Indonesia evading charges, and Ratner immigrated to Israel to avoid lawsuits related to sex assault. They're both accused separately and accused of engaging in that type of activity together. And Ratner's kind of an interesting figure, at least in recent years, because he teamed up with Steve Mnuchin's Hollywood studio to create, through his company that he created with the Australian billionaire James Packer, Rat Pack Entertainment. James Packer is a major focus of the Netanyahu corruption trial currently. A lot of that is, kind of mentioned in the piece, but there's a lot there to pick on. And Ratner was basically offered the opportunity to immigrate to Israel, apparently by Netanyahu, because a week before he did so, he was Netanyahu's guest of honor at the UN alongside Alan Dershowitz, the former Epstein defense lawyer. So quite an interesting array of special guests to have at your UN speech. And Ratner and Packer were actually recently at Mar-a-Lago dining with Musk and Trump. And apparently Ratner is trying to make his Hollywood comeback after being banished, basically because of all the litany of, sex assault claims against him. He's directing the new Melania Trump documentary that's supposed to air on Amazon at the end of the year, on which Melania is an executive producer. So
that'll be really objective.
Yeah. And then oddly, around the same time, James Packer buys this property neighboring Mar-a-Lago in Florida that had previously been reserved for like the Secret Service and close friends of the Trump family. So interesting that a major figure in the Netanyahu corruption trial, who became Netanyahu's neighbor, and that's part of what the charge is about, is now kind of repeating the same thing. And one of the reasons I think Brett Ratner is really interesting and his team up with Russell Simmons is interesting is because Brett Ratner is very much involved with sort of the heir to Mayor Lansky, Al Malnick, who's this Miami businessman who's basically credited, by mainstream media too, as inventing this way for Lansky and sort of other mobster bank figures like Tibor Rosenbaum, developing these ways to sort of launder money for organized crime from illicit into legitimate ventures, and created these banks in the Bahamas and all of that to do so. And Ratner their adopted son and adopted father. They're like very, very, very close. They have a lot of weird ties also, the two of them, to, Michael Jackson's final years. And according to Jackson, an attempt to sort of take away his stake in the Beatles music catalog, and a lot of really weird industry stuff there. But basically the ties to organized crime are pretty extensive. Brett Ratner claims to have been walked home from school in middle school personally by Lansky. Doesn't really make a lot of sense, but that's his claim, and his ties to Al Malnick are kind of significant. So, in looking at a lot of these figures, there seem to be a lot of organized crime ties. And, honestly, and I try and make this pretty clear in my book as well. Organized crime, despite the public perception that's been developed, did not magically disappear in the 60s and the 70s and 80s. Arguably, when in the organized crime figures rebranded as philanthropists and as multinational corporations and as oligarchs. And because of this system that was developed allegedly by Malnick, but also others, they're able to sort of launder money from illicit into these legitimate ventures. And so that illicit money pumps up these legitimate ventures and allows them to become hugely successful and dominate their respective industries, among other things, or buy out competitors and consolidate. And because of, a lot of the legislation that was passed in the Reagan, Bush, and Clinton eras, and so on, industry consolidation was allowed to progress to points that were previously unthinkable in the United States, creating, basically quasi semi-monopolies in a lot of our industries to the benefit of a relatively small clique of oligarchs who dominate the country now. And what I sort of note in the piece is that there's allegations from a couple sources that beginning in 1991, there were efforts within the music industry to culturally engineer hip hop to promote violence for the purpose of benefiting private prison corporations. And some of those allegations have been pooed over the years because of a difficulty in finding a direct connection between the music industry and the private prison companies. But MCA was involved in a covert operation called the Promise, that's remembered today as the Promise software scandal during the Reagan administration, that involved organized crime as well, not just intelligence and CIA and Israeli intelligence connections. And one of the main companies that was part of that, along with MCA, was Wackenhut. And so Wackenhut is now GeoCorp, the Geo Group, which is the second biggest private prison company. And it was at the time, all of this was allegedly happening in the early 1990s. So there is absolutely important connections there that really should be explored. And one of the allegations by people that have made this claim in the past about this move by record companies specifically is that there were, these private prison companies were going to wait for hip hop to be culturally engineered in the more violent direction before launching IPOs. And Wackenhut's division that ran its private prisons, WCC, waited until the passage of the 1994 Clinton crime bill to have its IPO, oddly enough. And Clinton, as well as Reagan, have very extensive ties to the Wasserman family. Arguably, Clinton, just as much arguably as Reagan. In the case of Reagan, MCA engineered his rise as a political figure, but the Wassermans were intimately involved with Clinton, including at the time he was governor of Arkansas, and also in, both of his presidential campaigns, major contributors, and also became one of the main donors to the Clinton Foundation, became very involved with Lee Wasserman's heir of choice and grandson, Casey Wasserman, who is now actually in charge of rebuilding Los Angeles after the fires and their Olympic committee for the 2028 Olympics. Wow. Casey Wasserman. He was also on Epstein's plane quite a bit.
That's insane.
It's complicated. And when you add the allegations that this same network, of which, the Promise software scandal, arguably part of the Iran-Contra nexus, Gary Webb argues those same people in the 1990s were facilitating the explosion of the crack cocaine epidemic in urban communities. And then other figures from the same nexus, as I mentioned earlier, were using these weird connections that sort of bubbled up in the 1996 presidential election that were investigated by Congress. That's remembered as Chinagate, but it's really this Iran-Contra crowd gun running again. They were facilitating the passage of all these, smuggling of all these illicit weapons that had been banned in the U.S. From China, mainly assault weapons like AK-47, into these same communities. So you have an effort to, culturally engineer through hip hop. You have gun trafficking and you have drug trafficking, all really targeting the same communities, allegedly for the benefit of private prisons. And it really hasn't been, explored that much at all. But I think a lot of people, these are scandals that have popped up on and off over the years. Prison, the Promise scandal was kind of memory hold in 1991, covered up alongside the related scandals of BCCI and Iran-Contra by William Barr when he was Attorney General the first time. And obviously Gary Webb stuff hasn't gotten attention since the late 90s, really, or early 2000s. He died in 2004. 1994. And since then, obviously, only people that sort of look into that era recall those, his reporting and those allegations. And arguably the Chinagate investigation, is now remembered as a campaign finance scandal, sort of like how Iran-Contra is remembered as a hostage scandal,
Right.
when really it was significantly more than that. And so there's been a lot of efforts to control the narrative about what was going on in the 1990s. So it seems like, Combs in particular was backed by this network and Bad Boy Entertainment, as well as their rivals on the West Coast, Death Row Records, as we note in the piece, seem to have been connected to these networks for the cultural engineering effort of this apparently broader op.
I don't know if I should tell you this, but I don't know who may be listening. There may be a group of people that want to get rid of me. They don't want me here anymore.
I don't understand. What do you mean? Talk to me.
I can't talk about it over the phone. I don't know what's going to happen, but I just feel in my soul, only God knows, they could shoot me. They could stab me. They could frame me and say I overdosed you with drugs. They can do a lot of things.
Who could do these things?
It's not the government. It's more than the government. But I don't know, Tita. I don't care. They can kill me. I don't even care my life anymore. I just want my children to be okay. My angels. I want them to be safe.
Michael.
I gotta go.
And I told him I was indifferent, and he didn't like that word. And he cried. And then the final part of the conversation was him telling me that he felt that that someone was going to try and kill him to get a hold of his catalog and his estate.
Hollywood has never felt this pathetic. They have never felt this meaningless. They have never felt this powerless, and that's for good reason. They are realizing that they're no longer rock and roll. Isn't that something? These people that branded themselves as against the grain, oh, I'm different, are lining up with the establishment, demanding that people get censored, right? Demanding the maggots have to go away, demanding that Trump supporters are terrible, that we are alienated. These people aren't rock and roll. They're government propaganda puppets, right? And they think that we can't see through them. Let me tell you something right now. You stop buying their music. The power that the government has, the power that Hollywood has, is the power that we gave to them, okay? You stop buying their music. You stop listening to their trash interviews. You stop doing what they tell you to do.
The moonlight falls on an empty street. Your laughter echoes, but it feels bittersweet. I trace your shadow in the midnight glow. Where you are now, I just don't know. The stars are dim without your spark. I'm lost and stumbling in the dark. Every whisper of the breeze is you, but it fades away before it's true. I miss you, my angel. Where did you fly? Left me here beneath this endless sky. grave.